The calm before the storm. For 2,000 years, peace had reigned across the galaxy. The many species of the Intergalactic Alliance had set aside their differences, united by a common goal: to build a prosperous and harmonious future. The wars of the past had become nothing more than stories told to children, legends from a time long gone. The Deathworlders, fierce and dangerous by nature, were an essential part of this peace. Their planet, ravaged by constant wars and chaos, had birthed some of the most skilled and resilient warriors in the galaxy. Yet in the Alliance, they had become something else: soldiers of peace. But even the longest period of peace must eventually come to an end. Unseen forces began to stir beneath the surface, threatening the very foundation of everything the Alliance had built. The Deathworlder cadets, new recruits trained to serve the peace they had known their entire lives, had no idea that they were about to be thrust into something far greater than anything their training had prepared them for. In the far reaches of the Alliance, on a quiet, isolated planet, the cadets were about to begin their journey. They were young, eager, and ready to prove themselves. But like all things in the galaxy, their path would not be a simple one. The academy where they trained was a massive, sprawling structure, a testament to centuries of progress and unity. Here, cadets from various species, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, came together to learn the ways of war and peace. Among them were 5 Deathworlder cadets, each one a survivor of the harshest environments in the galaxy. Their homeworld, a place where death lurked in every shadow, had shaped them into beings of unmatched toughness. Yet they had not come to this academy to continue the endless cycle of violence they were born into. They had come to uphold the fragile peace that their ancestors had fought so hard to secure. The cadets woke early every morning, training hard under the watchful eyes of their instructors. The curriculum was grueling, pushing them to their physical and mental limits. From simulated battles to lessons on diplomacy and conflict resolution, they were taught everything necessary to maintain peace in a galaxy teetering on the edge of chaos. But peace was not something that could be taught in a classroom. It was something that had to be felt, something that had to be earned. On the surface, everything seemed calm. The cadets trained in their simulations, the instructors ensured their lessons were learned, and the galaxy, far away from their isolated academy, carried on with its quiet rhythm. But the winds of change were already beginning to stir. The leaders of the Intergalactic Alliance, those who held the fate of the galaxy in their hands, had begun to notice something. Subtle shifts in the fabric of peace, quiet whispers in the corridors of power. Old grudges, long buried, were beginning to surface once again. No one spoke of it openly. The Alliance had worked too hard to maintain the illusion of peace. Any talk of rebellion or conflict was quickly dismissed as paranoia. But the cadets, innocent and unaware, were about to become the first to see the cracks in the foundation of this fragile peace. One such cadet, a young Deathworlder named Cal, had noticed something strange during his training. He was not one to believe in rumors, but there was something about the way the senior cadets acted, the way the instructors spoke in hushed tones, that made him uneasy. Cal was a thinker, not just a fighter. He had seen enough of the world to know that peace, no matter how long it had lasted, could always be disrupted. He had heard the stories of the old wars, the ones that had torn the galaxy apart. He had been taught that they were nothing more than history, that they could never happen again. But deep down, Cal couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He wasn't alone. His closest friends, Lyra and Jarek, had noticed the same things. Lyra, an alien from a distant star system, had a sharp mind and an even sharper intuition. She had spent her life studying the delicate balance between peace and conflict, and even she could feel the unease growing. Jarek, a Deathworlder like Cal, was less concerned with subtle signs and more focused on action. He was known for his fiery temper and his ability to dive into battle without hesitation. But even he began to notice the strange tension that had begun to fill the air. As the days passed, their concerns grew. The academy was quiet, yes, but there was something that felt different about this stillness. It wasn't the calm before a storm. It was the calm before something worse. Kale, Lyra, and Jarek could sense that something was coming, something that would change everything they had been taught to believe in. One evening, after a long day of training, the cadets gathered in their dormitory. The dim light of the setting sun filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. The group was silent, each cadet lost in their thoughts. It was Kale who finally spoke. "Do you ever get the feeling that something's wrong?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with concern. Lyra looked up, her green eyes reflecting the same unease Kale felt. "I've been thinking the same thing. There's something in the air. It's like the peace we've known is starting to slip away." Jarek, ever the skeptic, shook his head. "You're both imagining things. The Alliance is strong. It's been peaceful for 2,000 years. Peace isn't something that just lasts forever," Kale replied softly, his gaze distant. "Peace is something you have to protect, and I think someone is trying to tear it down." The others remained silent, unsure of what to say. They had all heard the stories, the rumors of factions within the Alliance plotting against each other, but they had dismissed them as nothing more than conspiracy. But now something felt different. The air was thick with the weight of a future they could not yet see, but knew was coming. That night, as they lay in their beds, the cadets couldn't shake the feeling that the galaxy they had always known was changing, and that their lives would never be the same again. The new cadets' first test. The following morning, the sky outside the Academy's windows was painted in hues of red and gold, as if the universe itself was trying to warn the cadets of what was to come. The sun rose over the Academy, casting long shadows across the training grounds. Inside, a hush had fallen over the young cadets, all of them gathered for the announcement of their first real mission. For the Deathworlder cadets, this moment was a milestone in their journey. They had trained for months, learning the tactics and discipline needed to protect the fragile peace of the galaxy. Now they would see what it truly meant to fight for it. Kale, Lyra, and Jarek stood together, along with the rest of the new cadets, their eyes fixed on their instructor, Commander Zelek. A tall, imposing figure, Zelek was known for his strict but fair teaching style. His deep voice boomed in the training hall as he addressed the group. "Today, you will face your first real test. You will not be in a simulation. You will not be safe within these walls. Your mission will take you to the farthest reaches of our territory, to a planet where reports of a disturbance have surfaced. This disturbance threatens the peace of the galaxy." The cadets exchanged uneasy glances. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. They had expected to be tested, but the thought of leaving the Academy for a real mission was different. This was the moment where their training would be put to the ultimate test. "You are not to engage in battle unless absolutely necessary," Commander Zelek continued. "Your objective is to investigate, gather intelligence, and report back. But remember, the fate of the galaxy's peace may rest on your shoulders. Do not underestimate what you will face." The room fell silent as the cadets processed what they had just heard. This was no ordinary mission. Something was happening, and it was clear that the peaceful alliance they had worked so hard to protect might be on the brink of collapse. Kel's heart began to race. The reports of strange activities, whispers of rebellion, and rumors of unrest had all been dismissed up until now. But this mission, it seemed, would be the proof they needed. Kale exchanged a glance with Lyra. Her face, usually so calm, was etched with concern. She could feel it too, the uncertainty in the air, the weight of the task ahead. Jarek, on the other hand, seemed more eager than ever. He was ready for action, ready to prove that the Deathworlders were not just peacekeepers but warriors. But even he could not ignore the sense of unease that had taken hold of the group. "We leave in 1 hour," Commander Zelek said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Prepare yourselves." The cadets quickly filed out of the training hall, heading to their quarters to pack for the mission. The sense of urgency hung over them like a storm cloud, but none of them spoke. The excitement was there, but it was mixed with a growing sense of dread. This mission could be the beginning of something far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. Within the hour, the Cadets were aboard a transport ship, the sleek, metal vessel cutting through the stars as it made its way toward the distant planet. The journey was long, but the Cadets barely spoke. Each of them was lost in their thoughts, thinking about what lay ahead. The planet they were heading to was a small, unremarkable world on the edge of the Alliance's territory. It was known for its peaceful inhabitants and simple way of life, but recently, strange reports had surfaced. Some said there were signs of underground activity, hidden movements, whispers of unrest. Others had reported seeing strange ships on the outskirts of the planet's atmosphere. The Alliance had sent scouts to investigate, but nothing concrete had come back. As the ship descended through the planet's atmosphere, the Cadets could see the lush forests and sprawling plains below. It looked peaceful, just as they had been told. The only sign of trouble was a small, secluded outpost on the planet's far side, where the disturbance was said to be centered. This would be their first stop. The transport ship landed in a clearing near the outpost, the engines humming to a stop. The Cadets gathered their gear, preparing for what they might face. Kale looked around at the group. This was it, the moment when everything they had trained for would be tested. He could feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, as if the future of peace itself depended on the success of this mission. Commander Zalek's voice came through their communication devices, steady and calm. "Remember your objective. Gather information. Do not engage unless necessary, and report back. Stay sharp." The Cadets nodded, checking their equipment one last time. Kale glanced over at Lyra, who was adjusting the settings on her weapon. Her eyes met his for a moment, and in that brief exchange, they both understood. This mission was more than just an investigation. They were walking into something they didn't fully understand, something that could change everything. The team moved out, making their way through the dense forest towards the outpost. The air was thick with the scent of earth and greenery, but there was an eerie silence in the air. Not a single animal made a sound, and the usual rustling of leaves seemed to have disappeared. It was as if the planet itself was holding its breath. As they neared the outpost, they saw signs of recent activity. Burn marks on the ground, overturned crates, and abandoned equipment. The outpost, once a bustling hub, was eerily quiet. The team split into groups, moving cautiously toward the main building. Kel's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, every sense alert. The peace he had once believed in now felt fragile, like a glass waiting to shatter. And then the first shot rang out. The sound of blaster fire echoed through the empty streets of the outpost, and chaos erupted. The Cadets were thrown into the heart of the storm they had been warned about, and Kale knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The hidden enemy. The blaster fire echoed like thunder across the desolate outpost, sharp and terrifying. Kale's pulse quickened as the sound reverberated through his body. His instincts kicked in, but for a split second, everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. He glanced at Lyra, whose calm face had hardened into something more dangerous. Jarek was already at the front, a grin of excitement flashing across his features as he readied his weapon. "Stay focused." Commander Zalek's voice came over the comms, steady and commanding. "Don't engage unless it's necessary." But even with the order, it was hard to ignore the rising tension. Whoever fired that shot was close, and it was clear that the situation was far more dangerous than any of them had expected. Cal's hand tightened around the grip of his weapon, and he moved swiftly, his training taking over as they advanced towards the source of the attack. The small streets of the outpost were lined with abandoned buildings, their once white walls now dirty and covered in scorch marks. The eerie silence, broken only by the distant thrum of their boots on the cracked ground, made every sound seem amplified. The deeper they went, the more uneasy Kale felt. It was as if the entire planet was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. They'd reached the source of the blaster fire, a group of figures hidden in the shadows behind an old storage building. It was hard to tell how many there were, but Cal could see the glint of weapons and the movement of bodies as they shifted into position. The attackers were well prepared, and their movements were swift. Too swift for a group of simple rebels or deserters. This wasn't a random attack. It was deliberate. It was organized. Cal motioned for the others to stay low and began to edge closer to the enemy's position. He could see the faces of the attackers now. Humans, just like him, but there was something about their eyes. There was a hardness in them, a coldness that Cal hadn't seen in anyone since he'd left his home world. These weren't ordinary rebels. These were soldiers, trained and dangerous. "We need to get closer," Cal whispered, his voice barely audible. Lyra nodded, her expression grim. "Stay silent. We can't let them know we're here." The group moved like shadows, silent and swift. As they advanced, the enemy seemed unaware of their presence, but Cal knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm waiting to break. The enemy hadn't even noticed the cadets yet, but Cal couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was at play here. Then, as if on cue, the enemy leader, tall and imposing, with dark markings on his uniform, stepped into view. His eyes scanned the area, calculating, but his gaze didn't linger long on the shadows where the cadets were hiding. He was looking for something, or perhaps someone, but not them. His focus was elsewhere. "Stay down," Cal hissed, his voice barely audible through the comms. He motioned for everyone to remain still, not daring to make a sound. But as the group crouched, trying to remain unseen, a low, guttural noise sounded from behind them. Cal's heart stopped for a second, and he turned just in time to see one of the enemy soldiers creeping up on them, a weapon aimed at Jarek. The cadets had been compromised. The world seemed to move in fast forward. Without thinking, Cal lunged forward, tackling the enemy soldier to the ground. A loud grunt escaped from the soldier, and they struggled, but Cal's training gave him the upper hand. He disarmed the soldier quickly, pinning him to the ground with a force that left the soldier gasping for breath. The cadet's hands were still shaking from the rush of adrenaline as he pressed the soldier's face into the dirt. "Get ready," Cal whispered harshly into the comms, barely catching his breath. "They know we're here." Suddenly, the sound of more soldiers running toward them rang out. The enemy had noticed the scuffle, and now everything was in chaos. The group scattered, each member taking their own positions, weapons drawn, as they faced the oncoming soldiers. It wasn't just a skirmish anymore. This was a full-on battle, and they were stuck right in the middle of it. Cal could hear Lyra's voice, calm but urgent, as she directed the team to take cover. She was in her element now, her mind working faster than Cal had ever seen before. Jarek, his eyes wide with excitement, was already firing back at the enemy soldiers, his shots sharp and precise. But Cal wasn't looking at him. His eyes were fixed on the enemy leader, who had just begun to retreat, barking orders to his troops. The enemy soldiers weren't backing down. They were pushing forward, their training evident in every move they made. But Cal and the others were not unprepared. They had trained for this, for moments like these. The Deathworlder cadets were warriors, not just protectors of peace but fighters when necessary. The battle raged on, and Cal's heart pounded in his chest as he moved from cover to cover, returning fire when necessary. The chaos of the situation made everything feel like a blur. Shouting, blaster fire, explosions shaking the ground beneath them. But Cal kept his focus. Then, amid the madness, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath the outpost trembled, as if something massive was approaching. The sound was deep, low, and terrifying. The enemy soldiers paused, their attention shifting to the horizon. Cal could feel it too, a vibration under his feet that sent a chill down his spine. "What is that?" Lyra gasped, her voice strained. Before anyone could answer, a massive explosion erupted in the distance. The shockwave sent them all to the ground, and the sky above them seemed to darken, as if the planet itself was reacting to the violence unfolding below. "Something bigger is coming," Cale muttered to himself, his hand tightening on his weapon. They were no longer fighting just the soldiers in front of them. They were now caught in the middle of something much larger, something far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. And the question lingered in Cal's mind. Who were these people? And what did they want with this planet? The enemy wasn't just a threat anymore. They were a sign, a warning that something much worse was on the horizon. And Cal knew, with a cold certainty, that this was only the beginning. The revelation. The roar of the explosion still echoed in Cal's ears as he pushed himself up from the dirt. The ground beneath him felt unstable, shaking with aftershocks from the blast. Dust and debris swirled in the air, making it difficult to see. He squinted through the haze, trying to get his bearings, but the sudden darkness of the sky made everything look unfamiliar. His pulse raced, and his breath came in shallow gasps. What was that? Jarek's voice crackled over the comms, filled with concern. Cale shook his head, trying to clear his mind. I don't know, but we need to move. Now. Lyra moved swiftly, scanning the horizon. That explosion didn't come from our side, she said, her voice tight with suspicion. It came from somewhere beyond the outskirts of the outpost, but it wasn't just a random blast. It was too controlled. They knew exactly what they were doing. Cal's eyes narrowed. He was starting to piece things together, but it still didn't make sense. Everything about this mission had been wrong from the start. They'd been sent to this remote outpost, expecting to find nothing but dust and silence. But instead, they'd stumbled into an ambush, and now something much more dangerous was stirring. We need to find out who's behind this, Cale muttered, more to himself than anyone else. We can't just run into the unknown without knowing what we're dealing with, Lyra replied, her tone firm. We need to regroup and plan. Cale nodded, his mind racing. There was no time to waste. They had to keep moving, but caution was just as important. Whoever was responsible for this attack had made it clear they weren't just another group of mercenaries or rebel fighters. There was something bigger at play. Cale turned to his team, his expression set with determination. We find the source of that explosion, and we find out who's behind this, whether they want us to or not. The cadets followed him without hesitation. As they moved deeper into the outpost, the eerie silence of the place began to settle over them again. The occasional blast of distant fire was the only sound that broke the stillness. It felt like they were walking through a ghost town, as though the entire area had been abandoned long before they had arrived. But Cale knew better. There was something waiting here, something dangerous. As they reached a higher vantage point overlooking the outskirts, the devastation was clear. The explosion had torn through several buildings, and the fire was still smoldering in places, sending thick columns of black smoke into the air. The scene before them was like a battlefield, but this wasn't the result of a typical skirmish. The precision of the attack suggested a level of organization that was hard to ignore. Cal's heart skipped a beat when he saw movement near the ruins of a collapsed building. Figures, more of the enemy soldiers, were gathering around something. Something important. It wasn't just a few survivors or stragglers from the earlier attack. No, these soldiers were different. They were heavily armed and more prepared than any group Cal had faced before. The cadets dropped to the ground, their breathing shallow as they crouched behind cover, watching the figures closely. Through the haze of smoke and dust, Cal could make out a distinct shape, a large vehicle that had been parked on the outskirts of the explosion site. It wasn't just any vehicle. It was an armored transport, designed for heavy warfare. But it was the insignia on its side that froze Cal in place. He recognized it instantly. The emblem was one he had seen during his training, back when he had studied military history, an elite mercenary group, rumored to have disbanded years ago after their brutal campaign on the frontier worlds. But here they were, back again, and clearly better organized than ever. What do we do now? Jarek whispered from behind him, his voice laced with urgency. Cale didn't answer right away. His mind was racing, processing what he had just seen. The explosion, the elite soldiers, the armored transport. It all pointed to one thing. They weren't just up against rebels or pirates. This was something far more complex. They were never supposed to be here, Cale finally said, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. Whoever these soldiers are, they're not acting on their own. They've been sent here for a reason, and I don't think it's just about the outpost. They're looking for something, or someone. Lyra narrowed her eyes, her expression growing serious. You think they're after us? No, Cale replied quickly, shaking his head. Not us, but someone else. Someone important. He didn't need to say any more. The reality of the situation was becoming clearer by the second. The Deathworlder cadets weren't just caught in the middle of a conflict. They were on the verge of stumbling upon a much larger conspiracy, one that could shake the foundations of the galaxy itself. A sudden, sharp noise interrupted his thoughts. Cal's head snapped to the side, and his hand instinctively moved to his weapon. He wasn't sure what he expected to see, but it wasn't what he saw next. Out of the smoke and wreckage, a figure emerged, dressed in the same dark uniform as the soldiers they had been fighting. But this was different. The figure was tall, even taller than most of the soldiers they had encountered so far. His presence was commanding, his steps deliberate, as if he was in control of everything around him. Cal's breath caught in his throat. The figure's face was concealed behind a helmet, but there was something about his posture that told Cal this wasn't just any soldier. This was the leader. And for the first time since they'd arrived, Cal felt a chill run down his spine. The leader turned towards the armored transport and waved his hand. Moments later, more soldiers emerged from the surrounding buildings, forming a tight perimeter around the transport. Their movements were precise, disciplined, far beyond anything Cal had seen before. This wasn't a random mercenary group. These were professional soldiers, operating under someone with far more power than Cal had anticipated. The leader approached the transport, and Cal's eyes locked onto the insignia on his uniform, a symbol he had only seen once in a classified report back at the academy. Imperial. Cal whispered under his breath. The name of the empire that had once ruled the galaxy with an iron fist. The empire that was believed to have crumbled, its forces scattered, broken. But here they were, standing tall, stronger than ever before. And if this was true, then the stakes had just grown far higher than anyone could have imagined. The hidden agenda. The air felt heavy with tension as Cal and his team crouched behind the remnants of the old outpost, their hearts racing. They had been exposed, and now they knew the true enemy they faced. The Imperial forces, long thought defeated. The implications of this discovery were enormous. It wasn't just about surviving this mission anymore. It was about something far bigger, something that could change the fate of the entire galaxy. Cal's mind was racing as he watched the Imperial soldiers move with eerie precision. Their leader, towering and intimidating, barked orders at his subordinates, and they obeyed without question, moving like a well-oiled machine. The cadets had been trained to fight against various enemies, but nothing had prepared them for this. The Empire's power and reach were vast, and their return could mean a resurgence of the old order, an order that had crushed countless civilizations in its wake. Cal, Lyra whispered urgently, her voice low and tense. We need to get out of here. We're not prepared to fight them head-on. We don't even know what they want. Cal didn't take his eyes off the scene unfolding before him. He watched as the Imperial soldiers loaded crates into the armored transport, moving with a sense of purpose that told him they weren't here for mere skirmishes. Whatever they were doing, it was part of a larger operation. I know, Cal replied, his voice just as quiet. But we can't leave without knowing what they're after. Whatever they're planning, it involves something big. Jarek, ever the strategist, added, we need intel. We can't just walk away and report nothing. If we leave now, this entire mission was for nothing. Cal looked at his team, his resolve hardening. You're right. We stay hidden for now. Watch and learn. We'll figure out what they're up to, and then we'll act. The cadets nodded, adjusting their positions to get a better view of the Imperial soldiers. It felt like the longest few minutes of their lives. The sounds of distant gunfire still echoed in the background, a constant reminder of the chaos and destruction that had been unleashed in the wake of the explosion. But here, at the heart of the outpost, the situation was taking a darker turn. Cale could feel it in his gut. The Empire wasn't just here by chance. They were looking for something specific, something that could not be ignored. After what felt like an eternity, the Imperial leader turned sharply, his eyes scanning the area. For a split second, Cale thought he had been spotted, but the leader quickly turned away and barked an order to one of his officers. The officer nodded and began giving instructions to a group of soldiers who moved off toward the nearby ruins. That was close, Lyra muttered, her breath held tight. If they'd noticed us. They didn't, Cale replied, his eyes never leaving the Imperial forces. We stay calm. They have no reason to believe we're here. But as he spoke, a part of Cale's mind kept questioning everything. The Empire's sudden reappearance, the precision of the attack, and the mysterious crates being loaded into the transport all pointed to one thing. This mission was about to become something far greater than a simple outpost operation. What do you think they're after? Churek asked, his voice filled with suspicion. Why come all the way out here, to a place like this? This isn't a strategic location, it's just a ruin. Cale's eyes flickered to the distant landscape. It was a barren stretch of land, surrounded by mountains and hidden from view, making it an ideal location for covert operations. But why would the Empire come all this way for something so insignificant? I don't know yet, Cale answered honestly. But whatever it is, it's not something they can afford to leave behind. And that makes it something we need to find out. The hours passed slowly as they observed the Imperial forces. Their movements were deliberate, methodical. Cale noted the tight security around the armored transport and the fact that they were unloading and reloading crates that appeared to be highly sensitive. But still, there was no answer to the question that weighed on his mind. Why here? Why now? Then, just as Cale was beginning to feel the weight of uncertainty pressing on him, a new figure appeared. The soldier was dressed differently from the others. His uniform black, adorned with intricate silver patterns, and his face hidden behind a sleek, dark visor. The cadets watched in silence as the mysterious soldier approached the leader of the Imperial forces. What's going on? Lyra whispered, narrowing her eyes. Who is that? Cale squinted, his heart skipping a beat. He recognized the figure instantly. It was an officer, but not just any officer. This man had been in the intelligence reports from the Academy. He was one of the Empire's top commanders, notorious for his ruthlessness and cunning. His name was Commander Rax, and he had been responsible for several covert operations on the Outer Rim worlds, worlds that had disappeared without a trace. Commander Rax, Cale muttered under his breath, his blood running cold. This just got worse. Rax's reputation preceded him. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a strategist, a mastermind who could orchestrate events in ways no one else could comprehend. If he was here, it meant that something far bigger was unfolding, something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. Stay low, Cale ordered his team, his voice low and steady. We need to find out what Rax is up to. This could be the key to everything. As they continued to watch, Rax exchanged words with the Imperial leader. The conversation was brief but intense, and then Rax turned and walked toward the crates. Cale could feel the weight of the situation settling in. Whatever they were moving, it was something of immense value. And it was clear that the Empire would stop at nothing to secure it. Cale's instincts told him that they had to act. This was their chance. They couldn't let the Empire get what they were after without knowing what it was. The stakes were higher than ever, and Cale knew one thing for sure. They couldn't afford to fail. We move on my signal, Cale said, his voice firm. We get in, we get out, and we make sure the Empire never gets what they came for. The cadets nodded, their faces grim but determined. They had faced danger before, but this was different. The Empire's return wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the future of the galaxy itself. The Great Escape. The tension was unbearable as Kale and his team moved in. The moment they'd been waiting for had arrived, but the danger of the situation was clear. The Empire was so close now, and they were running out of time. Kale knew they had to act quickly, or else they'd risk not just failure, but possibly the destruction of everything they had fought for. The Cadets moved silently through the shadows, using the broken ruins as cover. Every step felt like a mile. Every breath seemed to echo through the silent night. But Kale kept his focus. He had done the training. He had prepared for this moment, and now was the time to execute. They reached the outskirts of the Imperial operation, and Kale signaled for the team to halt. He raised a hand to indicate they should stay hidden, peering over the edge of the ruin to get a better view of the area. The armored transport was still parked just ahead, and the Imperial soldiers were loading more crates into it. But it was the movement of Commander Rax that caught Cal's attention. He was no longer standing with the others. He was pacing back and forth, clearly agitated. "Something's wrong," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. Kale nodded slowly. Rax's behavior was unlike the cold, calculated officer Cal had studied. This was a man who knew the stakes were high. Too high to allow any mistakes. "We can't let them leave with whatever's in those crates," Jarek added, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "We need to stop them before they get too far." Kel hesitated, weighing the options. They had the advantage of surprise, but not much else. A full assault would be suicidal. The Cadets were trained to fight, but they weren't soldiers in an army. They were just students sent to do a job far bigger than they ever imagined. And now they were up against an Imperial force that had been operating in secret, far more experienced than they were. "Rax is the key," Kale said, his voice steady. "If we can take him out, we'll cripple their command structure. The rest will fall apart without him." Lyra nodded. "But how do we get close to him without being spotted?" Cal's eyes narrowed as he observed the Imperial forces. There were several weak spots in their formation, places where the soldiers were distracted, their attention focused elsewhere. It would take precise timing, but Cal had learned how to make those moments count. They could use the environment to their advantage. "We'll wait for the moment when Rax is isolated," Cal said. "Jarek, you and Lyra provide cover. I'll handle Rax. Once he's down, we move quickly to disable their transport. We don't have long before they realize something's wrong." Jarek gave a quick nod, his expression hardening. "Understood. We'll make sure no one sees you." Kale took a deep breath and steadied himself. The plan was risky, but it was their only chance. If they couldn't stop Rax, they couldn't stop the Empire. The stakes had never been higher. Time seemed to slow as Cal moved into position. His heart pounded in his chest, and the weight of the mission pressed down on him. He glanced back at his team one last time. Lyra and Jarek were positioned strategically, ready to take action at a moment's notice. They trusted him, just as he trusted them. And that trust was their best weapon. As Rax took a few steps away from the main group, Kale saw his opening. The Imperial officer was moving toward the transport, his back turned to Kale and the Cadets. This was it. Kale darted forward, using the cover of the crumbling structures to remain unseen. His footsteps were light, calculated, his body tense with focus. He was close now, just a few more meters, and he could take Rax down without anyone noticing. But as Kel crept closer, a cold realization washed over him. There was something wrong, something that didn't add up. Rax had stopped moving, his head turning slowly, as if sensing something in the air. "Don't get careless," Kale muttered to himself. But it was too late. Rax spun around, his eyes locking onto Cal's with a chilling sense of recognition. The moment was shattered. "You think you can sneak past me, Cadet?" Rax's voice was calm, eerily calm, but there was no mistaking the menace beneath it. He had known they were there all along. Before Cal could react, the sound of blaster fire rang out from behind him. The rest of the team had opened fire, taking advantage of the chaos to cover Cal's retreat, but the distraction was brief. The Imperial forces responded immediately, springing into action with terrifying speed. Cal didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, tackling Rax to the ground. The two struggled, their movements quick and violent. Rax fought back with the precision of someone who had fought in countless battles, but Cal had the desperation of a young cadet with everything to lose. He fought with all his strength, the weight of his team's future pressing down on him. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Rax. Lyra had fired, taking down one of the nearby Imperial soldiers. Jarek followed suit, picking off another. Cal's moment of triumph was short-lived. With a brutal twist, Rax threw him off, and they both scrambled to their feet. But it was too late. The cadets had already overwhelmed the other soldiers, taking advantage of their disarray. Cal raised his blaster just as Rax made to charge at him again. "End of the line," Cal said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. With one final shot, Rax fell. The silence that followed was deafening. "Move, now," Cal shouted. His heart was pounding and adrenaline coursed through his veins. "We don't have much time." The team rushed toward the transport, their goal now clear: to disable the Empire's escape route and stop them from escaping with whatever they were after. They were close, closer than ever, but Cal knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something far larger than they had imagined. With Rax down, the cadets had dealt the Empire a blow, but the war had only just begun. The final stand. The transport was within their reach, but the fight was far from over. Cal and his team had made a critical move, and now they had to secure their victory. The Empire's forces were still regrouping, their officers desperate to maintain control. The cadets had managed to disable the transport's engines, but they knew it wouldn't be long before reinforcements arrived. They had to hold their ground, or everything they had done would be for nothing. Cal's heart raced as he scanned the area. The moment of triumph was still fresh in his mind. But now there was only one thing left to do: survive. They couldn't let the Empire escape. They couldn't let the sacrifices they had made be in vain. "Stay focused," Cal said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We hold this position. No one leaves." Lyra and Jarek took up defensive positions around the transport, each scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. The cadets had the advantage of surprise, but the Empire had the numbers and the firepower. It wouldn't be long before they came for them. Cal knew they needed to be quick, but he also knew they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. "We need to make sure they can't call for reinforcements," Lyra said, her voice tight with urgency. "If they get a signal out, we're finished." Cal nodded. "Agreed. Jarek, you take the communications tower. Lyra, cover him. I'll make sure the transport stays secure." As Jarek and Lyra moved into position, Cal watched the transport carefully. He could see the Imperial soldiers beginning to regroup, moving towards their location. The cadets had just a few moments to complete their tasks before they would be forced into another firefight. Cal's eyes narrowed as he saw several figures moving quickly through the shadows. They were more than just soldiers. These were the officers, elite soldiers trained for situations like this. They were coming straight for the transport. The tension in the air was palpable. Cal knew what was coming, and he wasn't ready to back down. He had trained for this, and now it was time to put everything he had learned to the test. "Get ready," Cal shouted as the first wave of Imperial soldiers emerged from the darkness. The cadets had to hold their ground. There was no other option. Blaster fire erupted from both sides as the cadets and the Empire's soldiers exchanged shots. The crack of energy bolts filled the air, and Cal could hear the hum of the transport's disabled engines as it struggled to stay powered. Cal took cover behind a shattered wall, peering out just long enough to see two soldiers moving toward his position. He aimed, firing with deadly precision, taking them both down before they could get too close. "Keep pushing forward," Kale shouted, rallying his team. "We can't let them take control." Lyra's voice rang out from the other side. "I've got their communications down, but we've got more incoming. They'll be here any second. Hold the line." Kale responded, gritting his teeth as he prepared for the next wave of attackers. The fight raged on. The cadets were outnumbered, but their training had prepared them for moments like this. They moved with speed and efficiency, covering each other as they fended off wave after wave of Imperial forces. Every movement was calculated, every decision made with the knowledge that failure wasn't an option. But the Empire's officers were relentless. The sound of heavy boots pounding the ground signaled the arrival of reinforcements. A group of elite soldiers appeared, their armor gleaming under the dim light of the planet's fading sun. Cal's breath caught in his throat. These were the soldiers who had been sent to deal with them, the ones who had been trained to crush any resistance. Cal knew that if they didn't act quickly, they would be overwhelmed. But he also knew that they couldn't afford to run. The cadets had already come too far. "Jarek, Lyra," Cal shouted, his voice commanding. "On my mark, we move. We take them down together." The three cadets exchanged a glance, their faces set in determination. They had trained for this moment. They had prepared for the impossible. Now was the time to prove that their courage was stronger than any force the Empire could throw at them. Cal signaled to his team. The three of them surged forward together, using the cover of the transport and the ruins to stay hidden from the enemy's sight. They moved with precision, their weapons raised, their minds focused on one thing: survival. The battle was fierce. The Empire's officers fought back with everything they had. But the cadets fought with the knowledge that this was their last stand. Every shot, every move, had to count. There was no room for error. As Cal moved closer to the front of the transport, he saw the Imperial officer in charge, Colonel Vark, a towering figure who had earned his reputation for ruthlessness. Vark was barking orders to his men, trying to rally them against the relentless assault from the cadets. Cal's eyes locked onto Vark, and in that moment, he knew what he had to do. Without hesitation, Cal moved forward, taking advantage of the chaos around him. He closed the distance between himself and Vark, his breath coming fast, his pulse pounding in his ears. Vark had no idea Cal was closing in on him. When the moment came, Cal lunged, tackling Vark to the ground. The two struggled, each trying to gain the upper hand. But Cal's desperation fueled his strength. With a swift move, he knocked the weapon from Vark's hand and pinned him to the ground. "End of the line, Colonel," Cal said, his voice filled with defiance. Vark's eyes narrowed in fury, but Cal didn't give him a chance to retaliate. With a single, precise strike, Cal incapacitated the officer, silencing him once and for all. As the battle raged on, the remaining Imperial forces began to falter. With their leader defeated and their communication system down, they were disorganized, vulnerable. The cadets pressed their advantage, fighting with all their might. The fight seemed to last an eternity, but in the end, the cadets emerged victorious. The Empire's forces had been defeated. The transport had been secured. And as Cal stood among his team, he couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished. The cadets had struck a decisive blow against the Empire, but the price of their victory had been high. They had lost friends, they had faced impossible odds, and they had fought for something greater than themselves. But in the end, they had proven something even greater, that no matter how impossible the odds, the spirit of humanity could not be crushed. The Deathworlder cadets had shown the Empire that they would never give up, that they would never surrender. And with that, the galaxy would never be the same again.